taking a look at sound design with Massive. We're going to be looking at using phase modulation. So I have a simple example here because once you understand the intuitive side of phase modulation, you can begin to apply it to more complicated sounds with somewhat of an idea of what it's going to do to your sound. So here's my example. If I play a lower note, if I get rid of it, so I'm getting rid of the phase modulation right here. That's what I have, and it's substantially less interesting. And so in this case, it's a good idea to bring this in my opinion. Other times, though, this can be a terrible move. It would sound horrible. Now, what's cool is if I do go into the lower ends of this patch, it will begin to sound quite cool, in my opinion. It will still sound cool if I add in the phase modulation in this case. It's like, oh, that's pretty cool. It just depends on what you're going for. So the patch itself is very simple. Depending on your definition is simple, because I have pretty much every distortion thing I can have on. So what we have here is, well, I guess not all of them, but what I have here is I have 3 wavetables, and I just selected these by clicking through them and deciding, oh, that sound cool, eventually settled on something that I really liked, and I'm controlling the amplitude of them with the LFO. We looked at this in the previous sound design with Massive videos. Now, this move right here, I shifted the LFO, the 5th LFO, over so that it starts at 90 degrees, or the maximum amplitude. That way, I get a clear click at the beginning of each sound. It starts like right when I hit the key. So that's what I wanted, and I also changed the X-fade curve up and all this stuff. So this stuff's pretty basic stuff. So next, I hooked it up to the amplitude, and I wanted some sound all the time, so I didn't hook all of them up all the way. And you notice that these two are backwards and this one's in the middle. So this is just a variety of sound, but because they're all linked up to the same motion, it still makes sense. So I've got that going on. And at this point, let's take the filter out of it. That's what I have. Not the most interesting sound. We could even get rid of let's get rid of the other things here. So that's it. That's our bass sound. That's what we're working with. Okay. So now I'm like, all right, before I go into the filters, I'm going to go into the distortion, because my first thing is I need some more harmonics so I can get an idea of where this sound is going. So I'm going to turn on the parabolic shaper and the sine shaper, and I get that. It's not that much of an improvement, and you notice that my dry wet is a little below. It's leaning closer to dry because I didn't want to color it too much. What I am going to use to color it a little bit more is some more distortion. So this time what is this? The teletube, whatever. So we're getting closer, and now I'm getting a lot more harmonics to work with. So this is just basically I was grabbing distortions, not with any particular idea in mind, just wanted more harmonics to work with. After I had my bass sound, I'm like, okay, cool. Then I'm like, all right, let's toss the filter into this. So that's an okay, I mean, it's a very dull sound. It's not a refined sound, but we have the main body of our sound sort of figured out. So next up, I went for some reverb. What is this? Small reverb, and threw that on there. And you notice it's very close to the dry on this one. I'm not really going overboard on any one of these settings. I'm being careful. Another thing, there's an interesting relationship that happens with the drive and dry wet knobs. If you have drive, what you can do is if you can ram your drive up all the way and then put a little bit of that in, and that will give you, typically it will give you a lot more mess in the low end, which is one thing you want to be aware of depending on the note you're playing. But also it'll give you a lot more high end. It'll give you a lot brighter of a distortion. And so you can mix that into taste. Versus if I were doing less drive like I am over here, I'm getting more mid-range, typically. And so what I'm going to do is I'll dial it in. I'm usually going to settle on something closer to the middle. But it depends on the distortion and how it reacts. It completely changes. But that's just something I've noticed with distortion plugs in general. That tends to happen. So those are some moves. Whether or not that's a good thing that I'm looking at it that way, I mean, we could debate that. But anyways, that's sort of what drove those decisions. So, okay, cool. We have our distortions going on, and we've got our reverb sim. So we've put our sound in the context of a space so we can sort of understand, I don't know, something about that just makes more sense. So now what we need is a more color, right? So we've turned on our filter and we have our filter moving around. Now we want some more color. So I'm going to use phase modulation. And bam, like right away, like holy crap, but that's like such a huge change. How did you know that thing was going to go to this thing? Well, it's a common thing that's going to happen. So I'm only doing this to 1. If I did this to you can't do it to multiple in this particular VST. But if you could get some really bright timbres. It could quickly become a mess. So you generally want to be careful. So you see, I have the ratio of 7, and you're going to notice there's a couple ratios that are sort of magic ratios. 7 is a magic ratio. 5 is a magic ratio. 0, obviously. 12, 24, anything that's an octave. Octaves and fifths are always going to sound pretty good. 7 holds some interesting properties. I believe 17 as well. Usually it holds some interesting relationships. Yeah, see, 17 fits in pretty well. So in this particular case, it's going to work with most of them. But I, in this case, like 7. And you want to be careful about whether you go up or down. Up's going to sound a lot more shrill and metallic, more like a cymbal being like scratched. I don't know how to explain it. Like a cymbal being shaken and scratched at the same time. And then if you go down low, it's going to sound like this. So in this case, I was like, nope, don't want to go down low. I want to go up. And I was going to just stick with 7. Okay. That's 5. I didn't like 5 in this case. So I was like, okay, cool. I have my modulation operator. Now you're going to be saying, how do you know which one you want to affect? Well, let's turn this off and let's listen to our various dry signals. So here I have oscillator 1. That's going through everything. And the reason this one is a good candidate is it's pretty darn there. You can tell there are harmonics being generated by the distortion, but it's pretty close to a sine wave. So this will respond in a way that I'm very familiar with. So I knew what kind of a texture I was going to get out of this. If I go over to this one, that's like a mess. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not sure how it's going to respond with that. Like, I have an idea of what would happen, but that's just a bit of a mess. And then our last one. But it's interesting to note that those things are in our sound, and we've come to those conclusions as a combined result. If you listen, you can hear them in the background, but it causes the sound to sound more full. But you would never guess that that's what you wanted there. And maybe now that you've heard it, maybe it's like a distraction. You don't want it there. But I highly doubt you heard it in the original sound. If you did, then you will have some special ears. So now I'm going to turn on my modulation operator. I want it on 1, and I chose one of my ratios that I find very pleasing in most circumstances. And the phase is only a little bit. So this is basically your modulation index. You're saying how loud is this thing allowed to be? So it's going to modulate oscillator 1, and you're saying what's the sidebands it's allowed to create essentially with this knob. Higher up you go, the more extreme the results will be. In this particular case, because we've chosen a ratio that's pretty close and it's a nice ratio, it's going to sound really nice and for most of the way. I set it on something that was a little darker, but you can see it gets way brighter because it's generating way more sidebands and the upper frequencies begin to dominate. And that's just the sound you're going to get generally. So that's this patch sort of in a nutshell when you're making moves like this. I tend to add in the modulation oscillator halfway through my process when I'm doing some distortion, and that's the color you're going to get out of it. So let's go to another sound called funny bass. And so here's a sound. And so it's sort of a big wah 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 sound. I'm playing pretty low too. Okay, and so I'm using the modulation operator here, oscillator, and I'm so used to saying operator. But if we turn it off, so that's actually kind of an interesting sound to me. It'd be good for some like jungle type stuff. I'd want to change the ratio on the LFO probably, and maybe even take it off the sync and do some weird unsynced LFO modulation. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it on, and I chose -5 in this case. I was like, -5 sounds good. That's what I like. And remember, you're hearing the effects of this. We cover this in the From the Ground Up series with Massive. So you're hearing the effects of the modulation operator, oscillator. You're not actually hearing it. And so here I have some ring modulation that's also going on. So it's kind of unfair to turn it off and then blame it all on phase modulation. There's some ring modulation that plays an important role. If I were to remove this, it contributes to the underneath texture. Remember those sounds that were underneath before? That's what it's contributing to. And so it's not a huge difference. As you play higher notes, I believe it becomes a little more audible. So there you go. Now you notice here on the phase modulation, I wanted to flare some of that higher texture in and out. So what I did was I hooked up LFO 6, with a moderate LFO rate. This is actually not as fast as it looks. It gets incredibly fast on this side, and this side has a much larger range on the low end. I don't know. I think the way they've scaled the knobs in this plugin are like whack. They are not intuitive to me. At least have the displays showed or something. But at the time this was made, probably wasn't. It was probably a CPU insane operation. I don't know. Anyways, I digress. So we have this, and I'm just changing the color. So if I play this sound, let's say I want to increase the phase modulation to get more of that high end, because I'm going to be using this sound throughout. In a jungle tune, typically the bass sound will be like wow, 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 wow. You know, it'll be the crazy fast drums underneath, and it'll be this just crazy driving tune. And so maybe I want to like have part of it be like wow, 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 wow. You know, like something that goes a little bit brighter. So you can hear that brightness that's very characteristic of phase modulation. And it's a very musical sort of effect when you use it that way. You're like, oh, I could totally see this as something that would organically change. And maybe it wouldn't come up that fast. Maybe it'd be just a small thing. And we're increasing that with the LFO 6. So it's already sort of happening with this. If I increase this to be a larger range, you hear some are brighter than others. If I bring it down, so it's just a really cool way of controlling things. And if you want to control something like that, you could try using the sidechain input and then use one of the macros to control it, or you could use the macro to control the knob itself, which is also covered in the Sound Synth Basics. So maybe you want to automate a knob instead, and you want to control the macro directly. Well, you can do that by that. That's all you do. You hit sidechain, and now as you turn this knob up, it will cause it to increase. And then if we wanted to go down, we could do that. And then, of course, you could just use this macro to straight up control the knob. Turn sidechain off. Now, you'd probably want to, if you're going to do this. See, this is where, when you're introducing things like this, you probably want to bring this down, bring this up a bit. That way you can restore it to its original position, because I want to go down a little bit, right? I don't want to, which is why controlling the LFO, the modulation of the LFO, which is what the sidechain does, could be a useful move. You're basically doing that right now. Essentially, if you could imagine, this knob's essentially moving as well when you do this. Anyways, this is basic stuff. So if you have any questions about this, let me know. I hope phase modulation makes more sense to you. Subscribe and have a blessed day.
Getting round, getting up and going down, getting round, getting over, getting round, getting up and going down. Now you will see Joshua will be getting round, getting up and going down. Cycle all the time in your mind and see the sign. Getting round, getting